It's March 9th, 2002. In a quiet residential area of Puebla, Mexico, far from the violent border that defined his empire, a man is celebrating his daughter's birthday. To his neighbors, he's a discreet businessman, a family man. But to the intelligence agencies of two nations, he is the target of one of the most extensive manhunts in history. Under the cover of night, an elite team of Mexican Army Special Forces glides through the streets, surrounding the house in a deadly silence. When the doors are breached, the man, caught in his pajamas, offers no resistance. There is no bloody shootout, no daring escape. The mastermind behind the most feared and sophisticated criminal organization of his time is captured without a single shot being fired. His name, Benjamín Arellano Félix, the lord of the Tijuana Cartel. But who really was this man who ruled with the precision of a CEO and the cruelty of a despot? Was he simply a product of his country's endemic violence? Just another drug lord in a long line of criminals? Or was he an innovator, a brilliant strategist who transformed drug trafficking from a business of thugs into a multinational corporation of crime, capable of bringing entire governments to their knees? Join me as we delve into the origins of the man who, from the shadows of high society, built an empire of blood and cocaine, turning his family into a dynasty and his last name into a synonym for terror. If you're passionate about the stories that power tried to hide, subscribe. What's coming is even darker. The saga of the Arellano Félix family begins not in the opulence of Tijuana, but on the dusty streets of Culiacán, Sinaloa, the historical epicenter of drug trafficking in Mexico. Benjamín Arellano Félix was born on March 12, 1952, into a large middle-class family. His father, Francisco Arellano, was a mechanic, and his mother, Alicia Félix, was a schoolteacher, a figure who instilled in her children a strong sense of family unity and ambition. Benjamín was the third of a large brood, 7 of whom were boys. Francisco Rafael, Carlos Alberto, Eduardo, Ramon, Luis Fernando, and Francisco Javier grew up in an environment where the line between law and the crime was porous. Sinaloa was the cradle of the first kingpins, and smuggling was an accepted way of life, a fast track to wealth and respect in a society with few legitimate opportunities. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Benjamín was not a petty young delinquent. He was intelligent, calculating, and possessed a vision for business. It is said that he studied accounting and aspired to a corporate life. But the real power and fortune in Culiacán were not found in offices, but in the plazas controlled by the narcos. The decisive influence on the family's destiny was their uncle, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the Godfather. In the 1970s and 80s, Félix Gallardo was the most powerful drug trafficker in Mexico. The founder of the Guadalajara Cartel, the first criminal super-organization that centralized drug trafficking to the United States. Under his tutelage, the young Arellano Félix brothers learned the complexities of the business, the routes, the logistics, the corruption of officials, and above all, the importance of violence as a tool of control. Benjamín, with his analytical mind, absorbed every lesson, watching how his uncle built an empire based on alliances and terror. Meanwhile, his brother Ramon, impulsive and violent, was more at home with the bloody side of the business, becoming the perfect complement to Benjamín's strategic mind. The fall of their mentor would be their greatest opportunity. In 1985, the brutal kidnapping, torture, and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena by the Guadalajara cartel unleashed the fury of the U.S. government. The pressure on Mexico was immense, and in 1989, Félix Gallardo was arrested. His capture didn't destroy the business, it fractured it. The empire was divided into fiefdoms, or plazas, which were distributed among his most loyal lieutenants. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán and Ismael El Mayo Zambada were granted control of Sinaloa. The Arellano Félix brothers, thanks to their family ties and the trust they had earned, were awarded the crown jewel, the Tijuana Plaza. This border enclave, adjacent to San Diego, California, was the most lucrative smuggling corridor in the world. Whoever controlled Tijuana would control the flow of billions of dollars in drugs to the largest market on the planet. Benjamín understood this perfectly. He didn't see Tijuana as mere territory, but as the headquarters of his future corporation. With his family as the board of directors, he prepared to build an organization that would redefine power and brutality in the world of drug trafficking. The godfather had fallen, and it was the nephew's turn to claim the throne. Upon taking control of the Tijuana Plaza in the late 1980s, the Arellano Félix brothers didn't arrive as mere outlaws. They arrived as conquerors with a business plan. Benjamín, assuming the role of CEO, implemented a corporate structure in his criminal organization. Unlike the more rustic cartels of Sinaloa, which operated with the logic of a rural clan, Benjamín envisioned the Tijuana Cartel, also known as the Arellano Félix Organization, or AFO, as a modern enterprise. The division of labor was clear and efficient. Each brother had a defined role that played to his strengths. Benjamín was El Señor, the Lord, the strategic mastermind in charge of finances, political alliances, and long-term vision. His word was law, and his focus was on keeping the business running at maximum profitability. Ramon, nicknamed El M, was the head of security, the ruthless enforcer. He was the brute force that backed Benjamín's intelligence. His reputation for sadistic violence and his taste for ostentation made him the most feared face of the cartel. While Benjamín moved in the shadows of high society, Ramon patrolled the streets, eliminating rivals and ensuring no one dared to challenge the family's power. Francisco Javier, El Tigrillo, the Little Tiger, handled logistics and daily operations, overseeing shipments and distribution. Eduardo, El Doctor, with his medical training, became the financial advisor and money laundering chief, using his knowledge to create complex networks that concealed their illicit profits. Together, they formed an impenetrable family nucleus based on a blood loyalty that made them incredibly difficult to infiltrate. Benjamín's main innovation was the piso model, a system of extortion. Instead of trying to control every aspect of smuggling, he allowed smaller organizations to use his border corridor, but for an exorbitant price. Any trafficker who wanted to move drugs through Tijuana had to pay a tax to the AFO. Those who refused or tried to operate independently were hunted down and brutally murdered by Ramon's hitmen. This system not only generated massive revenue without them assuming all the risk, but also gave them absolute control over the territory. They were the gatekeepers to the United States. To strengthen their operation, they invested in sophisticated technology and tactics. They pioneered the use of cross-border tunnels, complexly engineered passages that connected warehouses in Tijuana with properties in San Diego, allowing them to move tons of cocaine undetected. They corrupted officials on both sides of the border, from local police to customs agents, creating a network of complicity that guaranteed the uninterrupted flow of their merchandise. However, Benjamín's boldest strategy was his integration into Tijuana's high society. Unlike traditional narcos who remained hidden in the mountains, the Arellano Félix brothers became public figures. They owned nightclubs, restaurants, and legitimate businesses. Their children attended the most exclusive schools and rubbed shoulders with the region's wealthiest families. Benjamín cultivated an image as a respectable entrepreneur, a benefactor who invested in the city. This facade provided them with a layer of legitimacy and protection, making local authorities reluctant to act against them. They became part of the social and economic fabric of Tijuana, a kind of crime royalty that ruled in broad daylight. The Arellano Félix empire was not built on business strategy and social acceptance alone. It was cemented with violence so extreme it terrified an entire country. The architect of this reign of terror was Ramon, the younger brother, whose bloodlust and cruelty became the staff of legend. While Benjamín was the calculating brain, Ramon was the hammer. His role within the organization was clear: to be the chief of sicarios, the enforcers, the guarantor that the cartel's will would be done through fear and the physical elimination of any obstacle. Ramon didn't just order murders, he enjoyed carrying them out personally. He was known for his volatile temper, his disregard for human life, and an ostentatious lifestyle that contrasted with Benjamín's discretion. He drove luxury sports cars, wore designer clothes, and frequented the most exclusive nightclubs, always surrounded by an entourage of gunmen. His presence was a declaration of power, a constant reminder of who was in charge in Tijuana. Under his command, drug trafficking violence reached new levels of brutality. He instituted the practice of narcomensajes, leaving notes next to the bodies of his victims to intimidate rivals and authorities. The methods of execution were sadistic, designed to sow panic. Beheadings, dissolving bodies in acid, and massacres in broad daylight. Ramon recruited young men from the poor neighborhoods of Tijuana and San Diego, gang members known as narco juniors, sons of wealthy families attracted by the power and adrenaline of the cartel lifestyle. These loyal and ruthless young men became his private army, carrying out kidnappings, torture, and assassinations with terrifying efficiency. One of the episodes that defined Ramon's cruelty and marked the beginning of the war with their Sinaloa rivals was the murder of Armando El Rayo Lopez, one of El Chapo Guzman's closest associates. In 1989, during a party at a nightclub in Mazatlan, Ramon, in a fit of rage over a personal dispute, shot El Rayo at a point-blank range, killing him instantly. This act was not a strategic decision by Benjamín. It was a violent impulse from Ramon that lit the fuse of a conflict that would consume both cartels for over a decade. War had been declared, not over a territorial dispute, but because of the wounded ego of a killer. El Chapo's response was not long in coming, but the Arellano Félix brothers, feeling untouchable in their Tijuana fiefdom, decided to take the offensive to the heart of enemy territory. On November 8, 1992, Ramon led a commando of sicarios who stormed the Christine nightclub in Puerto Vallarta, a popular tourist destination frequented by the elite. Their goal was to assassinate El Chapo Guzman and his main partner, El Mayo Zambada, who were celebrating inside. What followed was a massacre. Ramon's gunmen opened fire indiscriminately inside the nightclub, killing 6 people. However, El Chapo and El Mayo managed to narrowly escape, allegedly warned moments before the attack. The Christine nightclub massacre was a public and brazen demonstration of the Arellano Félix's power. They were no longer hiding. They were willing to take their war anywhere, regardless of the consequences or innocent victims. This attack not only intensified the personal war between Ramon and El Chapo, but also marked a point of no return in the violence of drug trafficking in Mexico. The era of pacts and truces was over. Now, the only law was the law of the strongest. And the brothers from Tijuana, led by Ramon's fury and Benjamín's cold mind, were convinced that no one was stronger than them. Their arrogance, however, would lead them to make a miscalculation that would draw the attention of the entire world. The war between the Tijuana cartel and the Sinaloa cartel, ignited by Ramon's impulsive violence and El Chapo Guzman's territorial ambitions, reached its most critical and tragic point on May 24, 1993. This day would not only change the destiny of the Arellano Félix brothers, but would also shake the foundations of the relationship between church and state in Mexico. After the failed assassination attempt in Puerto Vallarta, El Chapo became the primary target of the Tijuana organization. The Arellano Félix brothers, feeling their power threatened by Guzman's growing influence, decided they had to eliminate him once and for all. The opportunity presented itself at the Guadalajara International Airport. The cartel's intelligence services informed Ramon that El Chapo would be at the airport that day, preparing to catch a flight. Ramon, true to his style, personally organized the operation. He led a group of his best sicarios, the narco juniors, in a caravan of vehicles to ambush his arch-nemesis. What happened next was a chain of catastrophic errors and a fatal coincidence. Just as El Chapo's convoy, traveling in an armored Buick, arrived at the airport parking lot, so did Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, the Archbishop of Guadalajara, in his white Grand Marquis. Ramon's hitmen, in a state of panic and confusion, either mistook the Cardinal's vehicle for a rival's, or, according to other theories, deliberately attacked it, believing it was protecting Guzman. They opened fire with assault rifles, riddling the cleric's car with bullets. Cardinal Posadas Ocampo and his driver were killed instantly, struck by at least 14 bullets. Amid the chaos, El Chapo Guzman managed to escape the shootout, fleeing on foot through the terminal, and eventually taking a taxi that got him away from the scene. The massacre at the Guadalajara airport was a scandal of international proportions. The murder of one of Mexico's most important and beloved religious figures shocked the country and the Vatican. The Mexican government, which until then had maintained a relatively passive stance on intercartel violence, was forced to act with unprecedented force. President Carlos Salinas de Gortari declared an all-out war against those responsible. The faces of the Arellano Félix brothers and El Chapo Guzman, until then figures known mostly in the underworld and intelligence circles, appeared on the front pages of every newspaper and on television screens across the country. They became the most wanted men in Mexico, with multi-million-dollar rewards on their heads. Public pressure and international condemnation forced the government to launch a massive manhunt. In the following weeks, raids were conducted across the country. Properties were seized, and dozens of sicarios and operators from both cartels were arrested. El Chapo Guzman, weakened and on the run, was captured 2 weeks later in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico, where he was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security prison. For Benjamín Arellano Félix, the strategist who had always preferred discretion, the airport incident was a monumental disaster. His brother Ramon's uncontrolled violence had put the cartel at the center of a firestorm from which it would be very difficult to escape. They were forced to go underground, abandoning their comfortable life in Tijuana's high society to hide in safe houses. Although they managed to evade initial capture, their status had changed forever. They were no longer the untouchable kings of the border. They were fugitives. The death of Cardinal Posadas Ocampo marked the end of the Tijuana cartel's golden era. The brutality that had given them power had now turned against them, attracting a far more formidable enemy than El Chapo Guzman. The Mexican state, backed by the relentless pressure of the US government. The war was no longer just for the control of drug routes. Now it was a war for survival. Behind every fortune, there's a story no one dares to tell. You already know where to find it. Subscribe for more. Despite the intense manhunt unleashed after the assassination of Cardinal Posadas Ocampo, the Arellano Félix organization demonstrated extraordinary resilience. While El Chapo Guzman languished in prison, Benjamín and his brothers managed to weather the storm, regroup, and ultimately consolidate their dominance over drug trafficking in Mexico for the remainder of the 1990s. Benjamín, the master strategist, took advantage of his main rival's absence to expand his empire. With El Chapo out of the picture, the Sinaloa cartel was temporarily weakened and fragmented. The AFO moved quickly to absorb routes, corrupt more officials, and eliminate competitors trying to fill the power vacuum. The organization perfected its money laundering methods, investing in a vast network of legitimate businesses that included construction companies, currency exchange houses, and tourist resorts in Baja California. This diversification not only allowed them to clean their profits, but also deepen their roots in the regional economy, making it even harder for authorities to dismantle their financial structure. Violence, though more selective after the Guadalajara disaster, remained their primary tool. Ramon continued to direct his death squads, but the targets were now more strategic. Uncorruptible police chiefs, prosecutors who dared to investigate, and journalists who published the truth about their operations. Intimidation became an art form. They used the kidnapping of officials' family members to force cooperation and death threats to silence the media. The AFO's control over Tijuana was nearly absolute. The border city became their personal fortress, a state within a state where their law prevailed over the government's. Their influence was so profound that, according to intelligence reports, they had more than half of the Baja California police force on their payroll. However, their power did not go unchallenged. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, El Chapo's partner, assumed leadership of the Sinaloa cartel and began to rebuild the organization. The war between the two cartels continued, albeit more covertly, with targeted assassinations and battles for control of secondary routes. The AFO also faced increasing pressure from U.S. authorities. The DEA, FBI, and the U.S. Treasury Department intensified their efforts to dismantle the organization. In 1997, Benjamín Arellano Félix was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, with a $2 million reward for his capture. He was formally indicted in a San Diego federal court for running a criminal enterprise, conspiracy to import and distribute cocaine, and money laundering. This indictment was a turning point. It meant that even if he managed to avoid justice in Mexico, he would face a life sentence in the United States if captured. The threat of extradition, the greatest fear of all Mexican drug traffickers, now loomed over him. Benjamín, aware of the danger, became even more paranoid and elusive. He constantly changed hiding places, used multiple aliases and communicated through a complex network of messengers to avoid electronic surveillance. He went from being a visible member of high society to a ghost running his empire from the shadows. By the late 90s, the AFO was at the peak of its financial power, controlling approximately 1/3 of the cocaine market in the United States and generating estimated profits of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. However, cracks in the empire were beginning to appear. The constant pressure from authorities, the war of attrition with the Sinaloa cartel, and internal tensions within the organization itself were eroding the foundations of the dynasty Benjamín had built. The new millennium would bring the beginning of the end. The dawn of the new century marked the beginning of the irreversible decline of the Arellano Félix empire. The pressure that had been building for years from Mexican and US authorities, combined with the resurgence of their rivals and a series of fatal blows, began to dismantle the organization from the inside out. The first major blow came in 2000, when the Mexican army, in a special operation, managed to capture Jesus El Chuy Labra Aviles, considered the financial brain of the cartel and one of Benjamín's most trusted men. His arrest was significant not only because of his position in the hierarchy, but because it proved that the Tijuana sanctuary was no longer impenetrable. Federal forces were managing to infiltrate their territory and strike at the heart of their structure. However, the most devastating blow, and the one that would forever alter the balance of power within the family, was the death of Ramon Arellano Félix in February 2002. Ramon, the bloodthirsty enforcer, the embodiment of the cartel's violence, traveled to Mazatlan, Sinaloa, deep in enemy territory. His mission was to assassinate his rival, Ismael El Mayo Zambada. True to his impulsive style, Ramon disguised himself as a judicial police officer and moved through the city in a Volkswagen Beetle, hunting for his prey during the carnival celebrations. In a twist of fate, his own tactic backfired on him. While driving down a main avenue, he was stopped at a routine traffic check by a police officer. Ramon, instead of cooperating, opened fire on the officer. What he didn't know was that the city was heavily guarded by El Mayo Zambada's hitmen, who, alerted to the presence of a high-profile enemy, were patrolling the area. In the ensuing shootout, Ramon Arellano Félix was gunned down. His death was a shock to the drug trafficking world. The most feared killer in Mexico had fallen. Not in a large-scale military operation, but in a street skirmish in the heart of his enemy's territory. The loss of Ramon was a devastating strategic and psychological blow to the AFO. Benjamín lost his brother, his chief enforcer, and the symbol of terror that kept his enemies at bay. Without Ramon, the cartel was vulnerable. The organization lost much of its ability to project violence and fear, and its rivals, particularly the Sinaloa cartel, saw a golden opportunity to advance on their territory. Ramon's death also accelerated the hunt for Benjamín. Authorities knew that without his armed wing, the cartel leader would be more exposed and likely to make mistakes. US intelligence, which had been monitoring the cartel's communications for years, intensified its efforts. They had identified Manuel Martinez, alias La Mojarra, as Benjamín's main messenger and right-hand man. Tracking La Mojarra became the key to finding the kingpin. The DEA and the FBI, working in close collaboration with Mexican military intelligence, followed his every move, waiting for him to lead them to his boss. Benjamín, feeling the pressure in Tijuana, had moved his center of operations to more discreet locations in the country's interior, believing he could go unnoticed far from the border. He settled with his family in a luxurious house in Puebla, a colonial city known for its tranquility, under the identity of a prosperous businessman. It was an attempt to recreate the life of discretion and luxury he so longed for. But the net was closing in around him. The agents following La Mojarra finally saw him enter the Puebla residence. After weeks of surveillance to confirm Benjamín's presence, the operation for his capture was set in motion. The end was near. The strategist who had ruled with an iron fist for over a decade was about to fall, not by a rival's bullet, but by the patient intelligence work he had underestimated. On the night of March 9th, 2002, as the Arellano Félix family celebrated the 10th birthday of Benjamín's daughter. In their Puebla hideout, the luck of Mexico's most wanted kingpin finally ran out. Acting on intelligence gathered after months of tracking Benjamín's trusted messenger, the Mexican government, in an operation planned and executed with surgical precision by the army, delivered the final blow. Unlike the chaotic and bloody battles that often characterize the capture of other drug lords, Benjamín's arrest was remarkably clean and swift. A team of Mexican Army Special Forces, specifically trained for this type of high-value target operation, surrounded the residence without alerting the kingpin's guards. Using the element of surprise, they stormed the property. Benjamín, who was in his pajamas, was caught completely off guard. He had no time to reach for a weapon or organize a defense. His empire, built on violence and intimidation, collapsed in a matter of minutes without a single shot being fired. Arrested alongside him was his lieutenant, Manuel La Mojarra Martinez, the man whose surveillance had been the key to the operation. The capture of Benjamín Arellano Félix was a monumental victory for the government of President Vicente Fox and a significant achievement for bilateral security cooperation between Mexico and the United States. El Señor, the mastermind who had run the most powerful criminal organization on the border for over a decade, was finally behind bars. His fall was celebrated by both governments as the beginning of the end for the Tijuana cartel. Following his arrest, Benjamín was transferred to Mexico City and paraded before the media. The image of a tired and resigned-looking man, flanked by masked soldiers, stood in stark contrast to the legend of the all-powerful and untouchable kingpin. He was incarcerated in the maximum security prison of La Palma, now Altiplano, facing charges in Mexico for drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized crime. However, his final destiny would not be in a Mexican cell. The United States government, which had pursued him for years and indicted him in absentia, immediately requested his extradition. The legal process was long and complex, with Benjamín's lawyers using every possible delaying tactic to prevent his transfer to the U.S. For nearly a decade, he remained in Mexican prisons as the legal battle unfolded in the courts. Finally, on April 29, 2011, his legal appeals were exhausted, and Benjamín Arellano Félix was extradited to the United States. He was taken to San Diego, California, the city just across the border from his former kingdom, to face American justice. On January 4, 2012, in a move that surprised many, Benjamín pleaded guilty to charges of racketeering and conspiracy to launder money. As part of the plea agreement, he admitted to being the leader of the Arellano Félix organization and acknowledged his role in importing hundreds of tons of cocaine and marijuana into the United States. He also admitted to using violence, including kidnapping and murder, to protect his empire. In exchange for his plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty and to drop other charges. On April 3, 2012, He was sentenced to 25 years in a U.S. federal prison and ordered to forfeit $100 million. The sentence was seen by some as lenient, considering the magnitude of his crimes. But for the authorities, securing a conviction and the dismantlement of his network was the top priority. The man who once said he preferred a grave in Mexico to a jail cell in the United States would end his days in a federal prison. An ironic end for the strategist who believed he could outsmart the superpower to the north. The capture of Benjamín in 2002 and the death of Ramon a month earlier marked the collapse of the Arellano Félix organization's original leadership structure. The empire, deprived of its brain and its enforcer, entered a downward spiral from which it would never recover. Leadership of the cartel fell to the remaining brothers, but none possessed the combination of cunning and cruelty that had made the AFO a dominant force. Francisco Javier El Tigrillo took operational control, but his leadership was short-lived and marked by increasing pressure from authorities and a brutal internal war. The Sinaloa cartel, now under the full control of El Chapo Guzman, who had escaped from prison in 2001, and El Mayo Zambada, launched a full-scale offensive to seize the coveted Tijuana Plaza from the AFO. The border city plunged into one of the bloodiest eras in its history, with shootouts, beheadings, and bodies hanging from bridges becoming commonplace. In the midst of this war, El Tigrillo made a fatal mistake. On August 14, 2006, he was tracked by the U.S. Coast Guard while deep-sea fishing on his yacht, the Doc Holiday, in international waters off the coast of Baja California. In a surprise operation, he was captured without resistance. His arrest was another devastating blow to the organization, which was now in shambles. Next in the line of succession was Eduardo el Doctor Arellano Félix, the financial advisor. He tried to keep the remnants of the organization afloat, but the hunt for him was relentless. On October 25, 2008, after an intense shootout with federal police at his home in an exclusive Tijuana neighborhood, he was arrested. His capture signaled the end of the founding brothers' direct involvement in the cartel's operations. Control passed to a nephew, Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano, El Ingeniero, the engineer, son of their sister Alicia. Under his command, the AFO was reduced to a shadow of its former self. It became embroiled in a civil war with a splinter faction led by Teodoro El Teo Garcia Cimental, an ultra-violent former lieutenant who allied himself with the Sinaloa cartel. This internal struggle further crippled the cartel, reducing it to one of many gangs fighting for control of local drug trafficking in Tijuana. Finally, El Ingeniero was captured in 2014, consolidating the Sinaloa cartel's victory in the region. Today, the Arellano Félix organization is considered to still exist, but as a small faction, a far cry from the monolithic power it held under Benjamín's leadership. Their legacy is one of transformation and destruction. On one hand, Benjamín and his brothers revolutionized drug trafficking, introducing a corporate business model, sophisticated smuggling techniques, and a calculated brutality that set a new standard for criminal organizations. They turned Tijuana into a synonym for violence and corruption, leaving deep scars on the border society. On the other hand, their downfall proved that no criminal organization, however powerful, is invincible. The cooperation between Mexico and the United States, though often tense and complicated, proved effective in dismantling their leadership. The story of the Arellano Félix brothers is a warning about the ephemeral nature of power in the criminal world. They built an empire that seemed unassailable, but it ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own violence, law enforcement persecution, and internal betrayals. They left a trail of thousands of dead and a more violent country. But their dynasty, which once ruled the border, ended like all the others, with its leaders dead or imprisoned, and their empire reduced to ashes. In the end, the story of Benjamín Arellano, Félix, is a tragedy of unbridled ambition, one that reflects the complex and often bloody history of modern drug trafficking. He was not a simple criminal. He was a visionary of evil, a man who applied the principles of business management to the world of crime with terrifying efficiency. His great contribution, if you can call it that, was the professionalization of the cartel. He transformed a band of smugglers into a multinational corporation with a clear hierarchical structure, a defined market strategy, and a human resources policy based on absolute loyalty or death. His insistence on social integration, on making his family part of Tijuana's elite, was a bold move that provided him with a facade of legitimacy and a level of protection that other kingpins hidden in the mountains never had. However, his greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. By building a dynasty based on blood ties, he created a rigid organization incapable of adapting to the loss of its key leaders. The empire depended entirely on the synergy between the brothers: Benjamín's mind, Ramon's fist, Javier's logistics, and Eduardo's finances. Once those pieces began to fall, the entire structure crumbled. His legacy is undeniably destructive. The war he unleashed against the Sinaloa cartel not only left thousands dead, but also introduced a level of public violence and sadism that was previously uncommon. Beheadings, car bombs, and massacres in public places became the norm, tactics that would later be adopted and perfected by even more brutal organizations like Los Zetas. The corruption he fostered deeply weakened Mexico's institutions of justice, creating a climate of impunity that persists to this day. Indelible stains that marked a generation and defined the perception of Mexico on the world stage for decades. The story of Benjamín Arellano Félix is a reminder that crime, no matter how sophisticated and organized, always ends up consuming its creators. He and his brothers reached the pinnacle of power and wealth, but they paid for it with death, prison, and the destruction of their own family. The empire they built to last vanished, becoming a footnote in the endless war on drugs. So, after this journey through his life and his crimes, the final question remains: was Benjamín Arellano Félix a criminal genius, a strategist who simply applied his talent to the only business that offered him unlimited power? Or was he ultimately just another tyrant, a man whose ambition left nothing but a trail of blood and misery? A king whose castle was built on a graveyard. The answers are buried under decades of violence and secrets. You already know where to find the stories that define history. Subscribe to keep unearthing the truth.